An obsidian blade can be sharper than a surgeon's scalpel. It can be made with 2 rocks and no metal. And for thousands of years, it was one of the most effective weapons on the North American continent. This is the story of 7 weapons that defined warfare in the Old West, long before guns changed everything. Before the Winchester rifle became the sound of the frontier, Native American warriors had already been fighting on this land for centuries. They didn't have factories, they didn't have steel, they didn't have gunpowder, but they had something else: generations of knowledge about how to survive in environments that would kill an unprepared man in days. The weapons they created weren't random. Every design had been tested over hundreds of years. Every material was chosen because it worked. These tools served 2 purposes: hunting and war, and often the line between those 2 things was thin. Native warfare wasn't like European warfare. There were no mass armies, no prolonged sieges, no cavalry charges in formation. Instead, combat was fast, personal, tactical. Warriors struck from ambush, they used terrain, they moved quietly and disappeared before anyone could respond. The weapons reflected that reality. They had to be light enough to carry for days, effective enough to kill quickly, simple enough to repair in the field, and they had to work without fail, because out there, failure meant death. What follows is a look at 7 weapons that dominated Native American warfare before firearms became widespread. These aren't legends, these are the actual tools, and understanding how they worked means understanding how people survived and fought in the Old West. The bow and arrow was the backbone of Native American warfare. It appeared in nearly every tribe across North America, from the plains to the woodlands, from the desert Southwest to the northern forests. And there's a reason for that. It worked. A skilled archer could kill at 60 yards without making a sound. He could carry dozens of arrows and fire them faster than any early musket could reload. The bows themselves were short, usually 3 to 4 feet long. This made them easy to use on horseback or in dense brush, where a longer bow would catch on branches. They were made from whatever hardwood grew locally: Osage orange in the plains, yew in the Pacific Northwest, ash and hickory in the east. The wood was shaped, dried, and strung with sinew from deer or buffalo. Some bows were backed with sinew to add strength and flexibility. Arrows were just as carefully made. Shafts were cut from straight shoots, smoothed and fletched with feathers to stabilize flight. The tips were the most important part. Arrowheads were chipped from stone, flint, chert, obsidian. Obsidian, in particular, could be honed to an edge sharper than steel. Under a microscope, an obsidian blade is nearly perfect. When an arrow hit flesh, it didn't just pierce, it cut. And if the stone tip broke off inside the body, there was no easy way to remove it. On the Great Plains, once horses were introduced in the 1600s, mounted archery became devastatingly effective. A rider could fire accurately at full gallop, reload, and fire again without slowing down. Against slower-moving enemies, this was overwhelming. The bow was quiet, it was fast, and it didn't depend on anything you couldn't make yourself. When distance collapsed and fighting became hand-to-hand, warriors relied on the war club. These weapons came in dozens of designs, but they all shared one purpose: delivering maximum force at close range. Some clubs were carved from a single piece of hardwood, usually with a heavy ball or knot at the striking end. The weight concentrated at the head turned each swing into a bone-breaking impact. Other designs used a separate stone head lashed to a wooden handle with rawhide. As the raw hide dried, it tightened like a vise. One of the most effective designs was the gunstock club, a flat blade-shaped club that could be swung with devastating speed. It could fracture a skull or shatter ribs with a single blow. War clubs weren't just weapons, they were personal objects. Many were decorated with carvings, paint, fur wrappings, or feathers. These decorations often had spiritual or symbolic meaning tied to the warrior's identity or achievements. Losing your war club in battle was considered shameful. Carrying one meant you accepted the risk of close combat. Unlike a blade, a war club didn't need sharpening. It didn't chip or dull. A well-made club could last for years and be passed down. In the chaos of close-quarters fighting, the war club was brutally effective. It didn't rely on precision, it relied on force, and in the right hands, one swing was often enough.
But not every weapon was designed for close combat. Some were built to strike from a distance before the enemy even saw you coming. That's where the next weapon excelled. The spear is one of humanity's oldest weapons, and in Native American warfare, it served for thousands of years. Early spears were simple, a long wooden shaft with a stone or bone point lashed to the end. They could be thrown or used for thrusting. In hunting, spears were used to bring down large game, bison, elk, even bear. In war, they allowed a fighter to strike from just beyond arm's reach. The design was straightforward, but effectiveness came from balance. A well-balanced spear could be thrown accurately at 20 to 30 yards. When horses arrived on the Great Plains in the 1600s, the spear evolved into something more dangerous, the lance. Lances were longer, often 8 to 10 feet, and designed specifically for mounted combat. They were light enough to handle on horseback, but strong enough to penetrate deeply. Plains warriors used lances in fast-moving raids. A rider could charge at full speed, drive the lance into an enemy, and either release it or pull it free as he passed. Unlike European cavalry, native riders didn't fight in rigid formations. They attacked in scattered groups, using speed and surprise. The lance gave them reach and striking power without forcing them to slow down. Some lances were decorated with feathers, paint, or cloth streamers, both for identification and spiritual significance. But decoration didn't reduce function. A lance in the hands of a skilled horseman was fast, deadly, and nearly impossible to counter if you were on foot. By the time you saw the rider, he was already within striking range. The tomahawk is probably the most recognized Native American weapon, but its history is more complex than most people realize. The earliest tomahawks were stone axes, short-handled tools with a heavy stone head used for chopping wood, processing game, and fighting. After European contact in the 1600s, metal tomahawks became common through trade. Steel heads were sharper, stronger, and more durable than stone. Some were modified into pipe tomahawks, a functional weapon on one end and a tobacco pipe on the other. These served in diplomacy and ceremony, but they were still lethal in combat. The tomahawk was versatile. It could be thrown with surprising accuracy up to 15 or 20 feet. In close quarters, it could be swung in tight spaces where longer weapons were useless. It was light enough to carry every day, deadly enough to end a fight in seconds. Colonial militiamen and frontiersmen quickly adopted the tomahawk. They realized that in the dense eastern forests, it was more effective than a bayonet. Native warriors used tomahawks in raids, ambushes, and desperate close fighting when everything else had failed. The weapon didn't just kill, it had a psychological effect. It was quiet, it was fast, and the person using it was close enough to see your face. By the mid-1700s, the tomahawk had become a symbol of frontier warfare on both sides. And even as firearms spread, the tomahawk remained. Because in close combat, a blade doesn't jam, it doesn't miss fire, and it doesn't run out of ammunition. Every warrior carried a knife. Before European contact, knives were made from stone, usually flint or obsidian,
or shaped from bone and antler. Obsidian knives deserve special mention. Obsidian is volcanic glass. When fractured correctly, it forms an edge sharper than any metal blade. Modern studies have shown that obsidian scalpels are used in some surgeries because they cause less tissue damage than steel. Native knife makers understood this centuries ago. Knives weren't primary weapons in battle. They were tools first, used for butchering game, cutting hide, preparing food, and dozens of other tasks. But in war, when arrows were spent and the fight turned into a grapple, the knife came out. It was a weapon of last resort, close, silent, final. After European trade introduced steel knives, they became standard across most tribes. Steel was easier to maintain and less likely to break than stone. But the purpose remained unchanged. A knife was what you used when there was no distance left between you and the other man, when everything else had failed, when survival came down to who moved faster. It was the weapon of final moments, and in those moments, it almost never missed. Native American warriors didn't wear heavy armor. Mobility mattered more than protection. Speed kept you alive. But many warriors carried shields. These shields were made from buffalo hide, the thickest part, usually from the neck or shoulder. The hide was stretched over a wooden frame, then dried and hardened. Some shields were made from multiple layers of hide to increase strength. A well-constructed shield could stop an arrow at medium range, it could deflect a spear thrust, and at long distance it could even slow an early musket ball. But shields were more than just physical protection. They were spiritual objects. Warriors painted their shields with symbols, animals, geometric patterns, images from visions or dreams. They believed these symbols offered protection beyond what the hide itself could provide. A shield wasn't something you hid behind, it was something you carried into battle with trust. In combat, shields were held loosely, allowing for quick movement. A warrior might block an incoming strike with his shield, then immediately counter with a war club or tomahawk. The shield didn't make you invincible, but it gave you a chance to survive the first attack. And in the kind of fast, brutal fighting that defined native warfare, surviving that first strike often meant surviving.
But the deadliest weapon wasn't made of wood or stone. It was something far more dangerous. It was how warriors thought, how they moved, how they used everything together. Native American tactics were as important as the weapons themselves. Warfare wasn't about meeting the enemy in an open field and trading blows until one side collapsed. It was about ambush, about knowing the terrain better than anyone else, about moving without sound, about striking when the enemy wasn't ready. Warriors used every advantage the land offered: trees, rocks, ravines, tall grass, river crossings. They studied animal behavior to predict human movement. Attacks often came at dawn or dusk when visibility was poor, or during storms when noise covered their approach. The goal wasn't total annihilation, it was achieving an objective: taking horses, capturing supplies, defending territory, or driving off intruders. A successful raid might last 10 minutes, strike fast, accomplish the goal, disappear before reinforcements could arrive. Psychological warfare played a role too. War cries, sudden appearances from unexpected directions, vanishing without a trace, all of this created fear and confusion, and fear was a weapon. These tactics shaped the tools themselves. Weapons had to be light, quiet, and adaptable. A warrior might fire arrows from cover, then switch to a tomahawk if the enemy closed distance. He might throw a lance, then finish with a war club. Nothing was rigid, everything was fluid. When firearms arrived, native warriors adapted again. They incorporated guns when it made tactical sense, but they didn't abandon the old weapons. Because the old weapons had advantages. They were silent, they didn't need gunpowder, they didn't misfire or give away your position with smoke. Even as the frontier changed, As railroads crossed the plains and settlements spread west, these weapons and tactics remained effective. Not because they were primitive, because they worked. By the 1870s, most native warriors carried rifles. The weapons described here were fading from active use, but they never disappeared. They were kept in families, used in ceremonies, passed down as reminders of what came before. Because these weapons represented more than warfare. They represented knowledge. For centuries, native people defended their land and survived in harsh environments using tools made entirely from the materials around them. No steel mills, no supply chains, just skill, patience, and an understanding of the natural world that most modern people have lost. These weapons weren't primitive, they were refined over generations, tested in real conditions, perfected through necessity. And in the hands of someone who knew how to use them, they were as effective as anything the frontier ever saw. The Old West wasn't settled by guns alone. It was fought for by people who had been there long before the first wagon rolled west, and the weapons they carried tell that story.